don't give up. Be relentless to creating something that is lasting and memorable and phenomenal and the best it can be.
You got a pillow if you lost yours. You got a seat at my table. You got a home. Here's somebody who believes you. Let truth remind you. You've always got a place to go to. You got a home.
Welcome to The Creator's Journey. I'm your host, Charles Gupton. Fears and obstacles on the journey of creation are things we all face. Every creator who works from the heart faces the same challenges. You are not alone. In each episode, I talk with creative leaders about the mindsets and processes they use to push through their struggles to create and put their work out into the world in order to make a difference. If creating an impact is something you're struggling to achieve at this point in your life, and you believe the encouragement and feedback of a trusted group of creative leaders could make a difference in your growth, I have a solution. I'm leading 2 Impact Accelerator mastermind groups to help a select number of creative leaders achieve objectives that are simply not possible working alone. If you're interested in building a new body of work based on renewed creative energy and deep encouragement to grow, please let me help you do that. Contact me at charlesgupton.com. And thanks for joining me on this journey.
Here's the key to my front door. Got a pillow if you lost yours. You got a seat at my table. You got a home. Here's somebody who believes you. Let truth remind you. You've always got a place to go to. You got a home.
Today's guest, Victoria Maddocks, has extensive experience in publishing, advertising, design, and retail, focused primarily in the beauty and skincare market. She is currently Vice President, Global Creative Director of Philosophy, a beauty brand that inspires women to look, live, and feel their best. Prior to joining Philosophy, Victoria worked in a similar position with Kiehl's, also a beauty brand. She was instrumental in taking the brand from one store in the U.S. to over 300 brand-owned stores in 35 countries around the world. In addition to running her own branding and consulting firm, the Victoria Maddocks Agency, she has also worked with Gucci, Estée Lauder, Victoria's Secret Beauty, Saatchi, and the Arnell Group. In short, Victoria understands the power of great design and how to turn it into sales and profit. In addition to her keen business acumen, she brings a vibrant energy and inspirational leadership, not just to the creator's journey today, but everywhere she goes. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. Wow, what an introduction. I'm flattered.
So walk me through, if you will, your transition from primarily being a print designer, including magazine, catalog, direct mail work, to the vast diversity of brand work that you currently oversee.
I think any creator's journey is a journey. And, I started off studying graphic design because I just really liked it. I grew up in England and I was very influenced by popular culture when I was growing up, which for me then was, 80s, 90s, and listening to people like New Order. And I think the reason that I actually studied graphic design was because of the New Order album covers. The designer of those is Peter Saville, who I think is an extraordinary graphic designer. And he probably was the reason that I thought, wow, how great that you can do this for a living. And that's where my journey started. And from there, like anything in life, it just meanders and evolves if you let your sort of gut and passion lead you, which is really what I have done intuitively without thinking about it. If I really thought about it, I'm not quite sure that I would have carved this out for myself. Starting in graphic design, starting from that moment where I studied and worked with great typographers and people. I was lucky enough to go to a school where it was taught by visiting designers and art directors who were working in London or in local cities, Edinburgh, Manchester. I think another notable person that influenced me quite young was Vaughan Oliver, who was a graduate of Newcastle, what was then Newcastle Polytechnic, and has since become a university in the UK, Northumbria University at Newcastle upon Tyne. He was another instrumental person. And again, I thought, how cool to do this for a living. So I packed my bag after I finished my degree and came to America. My sister had been here, so I just sort of followed her. And originally arrived in South Beach seeking some sun after many years in the UK where the weather was not quite so nice, to be really honest with you. I happened to get a job, doing graphic design locally in Miami, and met some people who were starting up a magazine called South Beach. And that was in the early 90s. So what a great time in popular culture to be arriving in Miami Beach. It was a burgeoning music scene, a really great creative scene. I just sort of fell into it by happenstance, and that was really how my career began. It wasn't highly thought out. It was just very, I guess, intuitively led. I was going to, you can stop me at any time. I was going to say, and from there, starting off in art directing and working in magazines where, you're telling stories, so I started off my career telling stories, and I still tell stories, but just in a much more expansive fashion. It leapt from the printed page, which little did we all know then that the internet was going to completely revolutionize our lives, and morphed, fortunately, to some great brands, and worked in advertising, as you've already mentioned. But, I think another key significant person in my journey was Tom Ford when I went to Gucci, who is an incredible visionary mentor, and a person who doesn't really limit his craft, which I think is part of the creator's journey, if you allow it to be. Now he's a filmmaker and, as well as an extraordinary fashion designer and businessman. So I think he impacted my life, as well as my father, actually. If we just go back really, really early, I grew up in the valleys of Wales, where probably not that much goes on, relatively speaking, to New York City, where I live now. My father's a self-taught architect and builds, is a businessman, but builds for his own purposes. I think I was very influenced by that growing up, him decorating and buying antiques, and as going to sort of furniture fairs and collecting antiques, and just really sort of growing up around, a very creative environment. So it's just sort of spawned. And from Gucci, I landed at Kiehl's, and little did I know that Kiehl's was going to grow to the extent it did. And, on that journey, I had to learn a whole hybrid of disciplines that I was less familiar with prior to that experience. Namely retail, but I discovered a passion for it. And that probably was the sort of second biggest sort of leap in my career, if you like, that, trained as a graphic designer, somebody who studies typography and letter spacing and leading and all kinds of, much more sort of nitty gritty things. You leap into this, the spatial world, the three-dimensional world. That really becomes a leap into a whole other side of the brand. And now what I do really is express brands at retail. That's part of the journey, but it's still storytelling. It's still exactly what I did at South Beach Magazine, which is tell stories and seek to make them visually interesting and seductive for people, and in essence make people fall in love with brands.
Absolutely. That's fascinating to me, in that a lot of people want to see what creative people are doing in terms of the specialty they're in, whether it's again, a graphic designer or an architect, or in my case, a photographer or a filmmaker or writer. And I also take the view that communication at its essence is storytelling, and how that story gets told may come through the specialty, but the important thing is that it is told consistently through whatever media or platforms that are being used. And in your case, you use, so as you said, a hybrid of so many areas, whether it's packaging and web work and retail store design. And it also occurs to me, which may be kind of a, well, duh, yeah, kind of observation, but the connection of the architectural work that your dad did to the retail design work that you do, the influence that going to shows and seeing that work may be having on your vision and the way you tell stories today.
Absolutely. It really, I was fascinated by Georgian architecture and all kinds of different architecture and furniture periods. In fact, my knowledge of history is really lousy other than the great periods in furniture and architecture design. So my peaks in knowledge are definitely around the areas which, I find more interesting.
Of course.
I'm sure that somehow, sits at the back of a person's brain and manifests it into a, something many years later. So I always was fascinated and spent a lot of time looking at different things and experiencing different things, which I think as part of a creator's journey is very enriching to be exposed to so many wonderful visual stimuli when you're growing up.
Because you've worked on so many numerous global brands, talk a little bit about your process thinking around the challenge of maintaining brand consistency while you're also tailoring it to fit a variety of different national or even possibly local cultures in which the stores and the brands are showing up.
Absolutely. That's a great question. Maintaining brand consistency, no easy task, actually. Communication becomes pivotal, and I'm very much in touch with my own team, and I am in touch as much as possible and just really talking through things so that people understand sort of where you come from, and ultimately sending a lot of evangelists out into the world that follow the same lore. But it's no easy task, and it requires a lot of patience, especially when teams change and, you experience things like the position where I'm in now, where a team, a company was transitioned from one side of the country to another, and new teams come on board, and everybody wants to be a creative director. We all know that in our side of the business. I try and lead by example. I try and inspire. I try and tell stories so that people are excited as much as about the stories as I am, and understand why we stay with the same story that has, is our DNA and is the soul of a brand. But it's not easy, but it is part of my role, and ensuring that people across all touch points really see the brand in a consistent light. As you mentioned, with a view to sort of other markets, at Kiehl's, that was something. The majority of the philosophy business is in America at the moment, but at Kiehl's, where I launched the brand in 35 markets, or not launched, but worked with the team to launch the brand in so many markets outside of America, that did require some thinking and some understanding of those cultures. If you think of a brand as a person, and I always like to do that, actually, it enables me to visualize a brand, and I think about those values and the personality of that brand or that person. And I encourage my team, and I actually share this with other people that sometimes struggle to see potentially the vision or understand the vision of a brand. And I use all kinds of visualizing techniques sometimes, but in essence, if you think of Kiehl's as a person, then, this person is really open-minded, hopefully, to other cultures, and you have a plethora of values and personality in your brand toolbox, if you like. And sometimes you might, up the volume on one more so than the other, so that things that might be more relevant in one culture over another, rise to the top a little bit more and become more a stronger brand entity than perhaps in other markets. So that's how I tend to sort of try and keep brands consistent. However, leave enough sort of elasticity really within the brand so that you really resonate. Because if you're a successful storyteller, you want to make sure your story is heard and understood and loved. in order to be loved, it just needs to be relevant. So I do bear that in mind, and I do try to understand cultures. And I think that was one of the highlights of my role actually at Kiehl's, was working with so many markets directly and experiencing how women, perceive beauty and perceive themselves in different cultures around the world. So that's part of my job, but it's also just insightful from a popular culture perspective, if you like.
At any given moment, I feel like a brand is really just one person talking to another person. Because if a customer's coming into customer service or gets them on the phone or in any way dealing with them, it's just one human to another in a sense at times. But the more we can humanize brands in that way, the more there is a connection point as opposed to just an anonymous entity.
Absolutely.
There were 2 points that you made a moment ago that I didn't want to interrupt, but I want to circle back into. And one is on the topic of diversity, which of course pops up everywhere now in terms of not only the customer culture, but also the work and a brand culture. And there seems to me that there is a great value in having diversity of age and nationality and gender and race and all those things that bring input into a brand. But then there are also times where it seems having a tight team where everyone thinks along the lines of the same story so that they can maintain some consistency as well. And those two seem to be, on the surface, opposing philosophies or thoughts that are there. Any thoughts that bubble up with you around that in terms of strengths and weaknesses and struggles even as you manage, hire, and put together effective teams?
Well, I always look for diverse, interesting people to be a part of my team. And I hope I always give them the freedom to think for themselves and to contribute, in their own genuine way. And like I said, communication is very important in this type of business. So by giving the freedom to express themselves, I also can guide them. Much of my position is in guiding the team so that we're all working towards the same story and the same direction. So because I oversee so many different functions, from packaging to copy to merchandising to digital to videos to campaign, it's actually much more effective for a brand if there is one person like myself, or sometimes it's a marketing figure, so that all the conversations and the stories and the brand consistency is maintained across all disciplines. But I value diversity and I value different thinking and different points of view, and I think that can add to the interest and the end projects of anything that we do as a result. That is part of the creator's journey. I wish I could tell you it was, well, this, it's not a straight line, it's a very wiggly line. Yes,
circling around.
Sometimes we meander around and around, and then sometimes, it's just a straight line.
More times lost in the woods than on a straight line on a trail.
Exactly. But then sometimes it becomes a very fast sprint to the end to get the mechanicals out the door.
That's right.
A few late nights and sleepless nights even sometimes on projects. But yeah, I think diversity is what makes a great team, whether it's cultural or, people's freedom of expression through their own sexuality or, whatever that is.
Back to another point, you've been quoted as saying that at the end of the day, especially for the younger consumer, the experience is paramount, even more important for them than the product. They want to live through a unique experience with a brand they choose. How does that perspective inform the process of your team?
Yeah, I always try and put myself in the mind of the customer, actually. And, in speaking to a younger customer, I sometimes imagine I'm speaking to my niece or, somebody within my circle. Brands are just like speaking to people, right? The kids, if you like, or the younger members of our society that have grown up with much more visual stimuli and phones and internet and all the rest of it are just, a new generation of consumers that engulf information in a very different way to perhaps I did when I was growing up, and to how other customers in our brand might consume media and information. So always trying to think about how to make it exciting, how to make it different. I'm working on a new store for philosophy that will open this summer in New York City. And, I'm really trying to push the boundaries of what we can do from a consumer experience there. I can't talk about it with you yet because it's top secret, but I'm trying to make it interesting for anyone and everyone that would, potentially touch our brand and any of the other brands that I touch. I think it's just harder with the younger generation at the moment because they're stuck to their phones and they just grew up in a different way. And, that's just another challenge of, the work that me and my team do just to keep it interesting and relevant. But I fortunately have a lot of millennials and a lot of, younger people in my team that keep me on my toes and keep me reminded, of what they're interested in. And I'm also active on social media, and so I'm also engaging, and I think as a result of all of that, I have probably shifted my habits, right? And now my expectations, even though I didn't grow up, with a phone stuck to me, my attitudes have changed, and my expectations of what I enjoy from a retail experience or what I enjoy from a website or a digital experience or any interaction with a brand has raised. The bar has been raised. And I think that's exciting for our journey because without a high bar, there is only mediocrity, right? So let's try to do something fun. Let's do something that, is memorable. So that's, I do think about that, and it does impact everything that we do. But I do try and make it interesting for everybody, including myself.
A lot of branding creatives seem to focus a lot of their attention on getting a visual style for their brand that puts the style elements first. But you seem to make a substantial investment in research before you even start with the visual elements, including hundreds of hours of video of customer shopping, and then personally locking yourself away to research history and heritage of the brand. How do you think your process of that research and discovery has contributed to the success of Philosophy, Kiehl's, and the other brands that you've applied yourself to?
Well, I like to think about things before I do execute. And as you know, as a photographer, once you start to execute any visual projects, you're in time and money. And I think by just taking a moment at the beginning of a project to learn about the customer, to learn about the heritage of a brand, I think it gives you a more rounded opinion of what a brand might be or could be. Don't forget that sometimes as brand creators or brand guardians or creative directors that seek to make a brand smile, if you like, we're taking the essence or even evolving a brand, right? Because part of what we do is not just static, it's the evolution of what a brand can be. And within the understanding of where, it's the same as taking it back to thinking of a brand as a person, understanding where they came from and what has got them to this point and how they have been colored as a result of that history, I think just brings a richer set of, creative subjects and elements to work within, so that the brand has a little bit more interest and a little bit more depth than perhaps what might appear on the surface, because we're always looking to make a brand. We make dreams come through, right? As creative people, we listen to marketers and to business people, and we absorb lots of conversations and ideas that they may have, and we turn them into miracles, if you like. And part of, in creating something that is perceived as a miracle or is, a brand that smiles, it is kind of figuring out, what interesting things you have to work within, whether it's colors or typography or photography or subject matter or voice. All of these kind of different elements give you a little bit of latitude so that anything that is expressed, whether it's a digital or retail store or a piece of packaging, has, a little bit of intrigue and adds to the overall bigger brand story.
Well, what you were just talking about, it kind of has a Disney-esque feel to it, talking about story and dreams coming true. I am right now midway through reading Ed Catmull's book, who is the head of Pixar, and his book is Creativity, Inc. And one of the points that he makes in there is the importance of getting their stories right at the beginning before they go into production. And a lot of what you were talking about aligns with that sense of having their story down, because once animators and the production people start putting the story in place, if it really is not right, then they're so locked into if not a wrong story, an unfulfilling story, it's really difficult to get people to back away and unlock themselves to go into the story. It's expensive as well as frustrating. So a lot of what you were just talking about aligns very much with that sense of getting the story right before the production and the retail design and packaging and all of those things get underway and then become difficult to back out of.
Absolutely. Not to mention that you're in for stacks of money once you start executing with
oh boy, are you?
Architects and video animators and editors and all the rest of it. Yeah, no, we really, like even I shouldn't say even, but my campaign team and the way that we make videos, we storyboard things out, we present storyboards. And then we don't just give storyboards in the creation of a video. Then when it goes to an editor, we work very closely with copy and every step of the way to make sure a storyboard is really, on track and everybody's loving it, so that you can be much more efficient with your editing costs or whatever the costs may be in terms of running a creative team, to the extent that, I have a pretty big creative team. So it's a lot of money for a company. You just want to make sure that you're spending dollars wisely and, not wasting time as well, because as you are full aware, there's never enough time in the creative process. We always want more time.
And more money.
Always want more time and more money. So I try and save, the time to where it really matters, so that we're putting our energy into projects that matter, and we're spending our money on things that also matter, which is beautiful photography and great directors and talented architects and interesting tech companies that can express things in different mediums. So I try and use it smartly so that we can do lots of interesting things, really.
And if the message is resonating emotionally at the storyboard phase, there is a high likelihood it's going to resonate even more deeply once the production is done. But if it's dry and not in any way connecting at that phase, pouring lots of money into production later probably isn't going to save a bad story.
No, and also, as you're aware, part of the creative journey is the journey. So as you're presenting storyboards, people often have other ideas along the way, which just adds to make a project better,
right.
To be honest with you. Sometimes it is hard for a creative person to hear, ideas or, dare I say, criticism, but
right.
That is part of what we do, and it does help make a project the best it can be, so that the messaging is very succinct and it's snappy and it's dramatic if we're talking in the context of a video, but that the whole piece is, the best it can be. And I think by sharing work as you go along the way, you get that really valuable contribution that just is very organic. It's good for any creator to work in that way versus, a vacuum.
On another note related to the branding process, we live in a culture, it's pretty obvious, of constant media noise and often brash overstatement in advertising, especially, it seems like, in beauty products and in fashion and in that world. How important is the ability to recognize and exercise a discipline of restraint in your messaging?
We do live in a very saturated media world, but I think that makes the media landscape just more competitive, which is actually good for a creative person. So,
well, I'm thinking restraint in the story, restraint in statement of things. Specifically, what comes to mind in beauty products, there's so much hype in terms of if you buy this jar of stuff and put it on or whatever it may be, suddenly you're going to have, all of the love of your life, and you're going to sleep better and better sex and lose 40 pounds, whatever it might be. There's so much hype.
Oh, okay.
What is the value of restraint in terms of building story and building connection and authenticity?
Fortunately, first of all, I work for a brand that believes in under-promising and over-delivering, so that makes the get-go a little bit easier for me. But, I'm a consumer, and I think of myself, I try and put myself in the mind of the customer. And we are living in a world where authenticity is paramount. A millennial customer really can barely relate to a brand that's not authentic. So, and it's just the way I like to approach work. I think I don't want to disappoint a customer ever, so I'd prefer to be more and of course, from a commercial standpoint, you're always trying to sell a product or a story, but I think if you tell interesting stories in an authentic way, they tend to speak for themselves, and then the sales come. So I kind of try and approach it really in a way that, how would I like the message to be received myself? And I also, like a cajillion other millennials, appreciate an authentic story and something that's not overhyped or, a product that's going to overpromise and then I'm going to be, disappointed.
Well, on the subject of authentic stories, tell me about how the Philosophy Stories of Grace series got traction.
Stories of Grace, the three ladies that we...
Yeah, the film series, right? Those are just beautiful and very, very touching and authentic.
Thank you. I love those two, and wow, what a privilege to meet those three ladies. It was actually the idea of a colleague of mine in marketing. It was Rachel's idea, and I just thought what a genius idea to reach out to our social community and ask them to put forward ladies that they knew that had perhaps triumphed through tough times. And it's inspired by the Philosophy on the Amazing Grace package, which is perhaps one of my most favorite philosophies at Philosophy. It's about climbing up the mountain. I can actually read it to you. How you climb up the mountain is just as important as you get down the mountain. And so it is with life, which for many of us becomes one gigantic test followed by one gigantic lesson. In the end, it all comes down to one word, grace. It's how you accept winning and losing, good luck and bad luck, the darkness and the light.
That's lovely.
How beautiful is that? So, that's the product that we're starting with. And we thought, it would be interesting to reach out to some women that, had some challenges climbing up the mountain, and for them to share their stories, their authentic stories. So that's where the idea came from. Like I said, it wasn't my own, but I made it happen, and I brought it to fruition. It is one of the most interesting projects I've worked on at Philosophy. They were well received, and what was actually phenomenal when we published them on their Facebook pages, of which I'm connected to all these fantastic women, there was lots of commentary from other women who had been in similar, challenging situations. So it really inspired a community of women to talk and share, be sort of stronger together, if that makes sense. And I think that's incredible when a brand has that power, if you like, or the brand has the enabler for conversation between other women. So I think that was a privilege to be able to share their stories, and they were very courageous to share them in the way that they did.
Is it a series that will continue?
It could quite possibly. We're talking about a new brand project, a new brand campaign, of which I've just recently presented. And again, I can't tell you about that just now because it's still in its confidential stage. But, it is on the authentic trajectory, which seems so right and so relevant for this brand. And it will continue to share stories. And I can tell you more about it at a later date. But I think it's inspired other work, which is really nice when one project inspires another project.
Yes.
And perhaps this is something which, we can do more of, and that has a place in this very media saturated world. You're always working against, one of the challenges of that project was it didn't do the stories justice to kind of whittle them down to 30 seconds, which is a kind of a world that we live in, or the perception is that, nobody has a concentration span beyond 15 or 20 seconds. But we made long versions of them. Interestingly, the long versions resonated very well with audiences. So it's sort of testament to sometimes going against the grain and just keeping with your gut and telling an authentic story in a beautiful way that, they can be as powerful as little snacky pieces of media that, can be digested down our phones.
And just to let folks know that when you say long form, the long form pieces are about 2 minutes or less. So they won't take a lot of commitment to be inspired and encouraged.
Not at all. They might, I think in this series, they're about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes.
Yeah, so they're pretty tight. But jumping back to one of the points that you were talking about, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper because I think it's relevant to a bigger brand story as well. When you're planning or producing, especially personal, intimate stories like these, how do you decide which elements to leave in and what to cut? Because, for instance, the story of Connie, who went from being homeless to graduating from Harvard, left out the entire chapters of her journey out of homelessness through graduation, but also, at the same time telling other aspects of her story. How are those choices made? Because again, I think it goes to the bigger brand story. We often want to include everything, and that just overwhelms people.
Absolutely. Well, I felt like in that series, I virtually edited the piece myself, but it's also based on what that person will share. And in the context of Connie, she did not want to talk about her times when she was homeless. I think it was a very dark period for her, and she just didn't want to talk about it. So, like anything, I would never push anybody into saying something on camera that they didn't feel comfortable saying. So we gave her a really safe space to say her story however she wanted to say it, which is her authentic story. So I was working with material that, she gave me, and what we thought was the most relevant to, where she found herself, which is, yes, Harvard with these like cajillions of degrees. I mean, can you not be more inspired by a woman, who has not been given all the privileges that I was certainly given, and has just, carved an extraordinary life for herself. So those women actually had a real impact. Those 3 women, they don't know it, but they had a huge impact on my life as well, so it goes both ways when you're telling stories. It becomes part of the fabric of you in some ways.
It does.
I just tried to tell the story as efficiently, yet, not chopping it or editing it so much that it lost its heart. And that's always a tricky balance.
Boy, is it. Yeah, they're quite inspiring. And to that point as well, a number of creative leaders that I've spoken with, but especially women, have difficulty acknowledging the core strengths and value that they bring to the table. You don't in any way, to me, seem to be boastful, but you also appear to grasp your own strengths and the benefits that you have to offer. Where did that ability or understanding develop? and how do you encourage it in the creatives that you mentor or work with?
I think experience, you learn what your strengths are through trial and error, right?
Hopefully.
As a kid, if as a kid we're a bad skier or a bad bike rider, we tend not to do it over and over again. But, I just get so much from working with other great creative people that, they share pretty quickly what works and doesn't work for them. And I don't know, I think it's just part of the journey, and, self-evolution and self-development and learning more about yourself and learning what, you can make a greater contribution at than some of the other things. I started off on the Mac, and I still like to do my own projects and, be on the Mac myself, but it's less often than I used to be. So, my contribution now is much more as a thinker and a guider. And, interestingly enough, I tend to ask a question in an interview, and I hope this not to give the game away for anybody else I'll interview down the road. But I actually tend to ask candidates their strengths and their weaknesses, because I do think of our team and anybody I add to the team as a sort of contribution of the whole. So if we need somebody that has a particular area of expertise that one of us doesn't have, then I'm looking for that area of expertise in another candidate. So as a team, we're able to be very well-rounded, or we have a sort of a deeper understanding of any medium or discipline. So I think I always encourage people to, to follow their strengths and build on their strengths. Same for brand. Brand builds on its strengths as well. So it's always working from the areas of strengths, and life is that mountain, right? The words of wisdom on Amazing Grace. It can be for many of us one gigantic test followed by one big gigantic lesson. So, it's in those moments that I think we grow. And I think that's exciting for me. It's a privilege for me to watch my team flourish and bloom. I do my best to nurture them, and that sometimes is not with water, it's with a boatload of wine or something that's a lot more fun. But there is a lot of nurturing in this business, and I think when you see those people blossom and become even stronger, either in their craft or in how they approach projects and in their maturity, that's really fun for me to watch, and I learn from it too. So it's kind of it all feeds itself. It all feeds each other.
When you think of the personal qualities that you may or may not have recognized earlier in your career that have served you well, from your perspectives, are there qualities that you see lacking in younger creatives coming up that they need to succeed at their highest ability in the years to come?
I grew up sort of a little bit hybrid, old school and new school. So when I was doing my degree, the Mac had come out, and I was on the Mac when I was studying. But at the same time, the school that I went to made you go through lead typesetting and really understanding the craft of typography and the craft of graphic design. And I think I was really fortunate that I had that background. I know some schools value it more than others. And sometimes I see in graphic designers today, they just, allow the type to come out of the Mac, and sometimes it just looks like it came out of a can of soup. We have to throw it back and kind of make it look like it's the most beautiful presentation it can be. And you look at letter spacing, and when you're working on a brand that is so much about voice and words and type, you really and it's hard as well on the scale that we work, because we are delivering and releasing countless mechanicals on a daily basis, that you really make sure that your younger members of the team that might be touching a file, or anybody who's finessing a file before it goes off to print or into digital cyberspace, that they're really thinking about letter spacing and leading and a lot of those old traditional presentation mediums, so that the work is really beautifully presented and looks very elegant. That's at the end of the day what we're trying to do with a lot of the things that we present, or at least with this brand, that the typographic presentation is elegant and is does the poetry justice. So I do tend to see that in younger people, but I try and encourage them to really pay attention to it, because I think that's really what it is. And I try and teach them little things that they may not have been taught. And we get there as a team. So I think that's the thing that tends to sort of I see lacking most, but they also bring other things that perhaps a more seasoned designer or typographer might not bring. So it all works out in the end.
We've talked a good bit about story and narrative. Is there a narrative or a story that you are interested in growing or stepping into? Are there any fears or obstacles or struggles that are in any way standing in the way of you moving into some new areas of growth?
There's always obstacles. I think it would almost be impossible to get through any project or any life moment without challenges and obstacles. But I just try and approach them, head on, really. If I believe in something, I try and visualize the end state, and I just make it happen. I think I apply that to pretty much anything I do. I try not to limit myself, but yet at the same time, continue to refine a craft.
Well, yeah, I asked the question because there are times that people are kind of living in a story that's limiting their capacity and are just waiting for an opportunity to kind of let some of that out or voice it in a way. So I was just asking, because you never know when something's in there that has not been voiced, giving opportunity to voice a narrative or a story or something bigger that you see for yourself.
I tend to work on things that I find really interesting, and I've always followed my heart in anything that I do in my career, and I expect I will continue to do the same. I don't think of limitations as crazy as that sounds. And as a kid, I absolutely had no fear. And as much as when we get older, I think we tend to fear more. What's nice about the brand I work on, actually, and it was a very pleasant reminder when I joined the brand, that there is this heritage in our brand about seeing a picture or a story through a child's eyes. That reminded me, in fact, it's true, actually, and on our business cards, we have our own kid picture printed on the back. I might have to send you a printed one just so that you know what I look like as a kid.
That's funny.
But that's what we do in this brand. And I it was such a lovely reminder, because I said to myself, yes, I was a kid that, had two older sisters. So I was like the youngest daughter amongst a fairly big family. I think I probably was able to meander, my own way because I was so much younger, and maybe that happens when you're the runt of the pack. I'm not sure, but I really didn't have any fear as a child, and I try to go through life with the same feeling. I think you have to remind yourself it's not easy sometimes, but I don't know what tomorrow brings for me, but I know it's exciting. That much I can tell you.
That's an attitude to bank on. Is there something that you believe in the core of your being to be true that most other people probably would not agree with you on?
I don't know. I mean, I'm quite a straight shooter. I think what you see is what you get, and people tend to appreciate that, or if they don't stick around. This brand reminded me to try and look at things through a child's eyes. I think there's a vulnerability in a child, and I think there's a vulnerability actually in the work that I do. So allowing yourself to be a little vulnerable sometimes can make can maybe, stretch you, and can maybe, make it a little bit more uncomfortable for a creative person, especially somebody like myself. And I think that's okay. And I try and be okay with that. Sometimes I'm not, but I try and be okay with it. And I think it tends to make things better or more genuine, maybe.
Are there a few books that you've read that have affected or impacted you in some significant ways?
Well, there's a book that I'm about to buy and read that I suspect might impact me because I'm so intrigued to read it. But a good friend of mine who's a journalist has a daughter and mentioned actually the other day a book by Nancy Jo Sales called American Girls. and it's about how American girls struggle and face the digital world that we're living in. And I thought, wow, that's good. And, you know, she's buying it to be more educated about her daughter, but I thought, what an interesting book to pick up on. So I've got that in my reading list. But prior to that, oh my goodness, so many. You know, it's not sort of profound, but you know, I love David Sedaris. He just makes me laugh, and I love Holidays on Ice, just because it's so fantastic and ridiculous. So I think all kinds of books impact me, actually. You know, from storytelling to biographies and autobiographies.
Yeah, I find that creative people who are well read generally have a broader scope of tools, resources, and ideas that they draw from. And I always like to, for personal reasons, learn about things that are media that are impacting other people. American Girls was not on my radar, and now it will be for that reason, but also to share with others, to, again, broaden the scope of what's inspiring people. So good. You've added a book to my list. What do you want to be remembered for?
Building great brands. Bringing back, you know, I'd love to, and one of the reasons that I joined this brand was, you know, it needed a little bit of visual TLC. The voice was all there, but the task in hand was to modernize and elevate the brand with a cohesive brand, you know, modern and brand image. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing to be remembered for. I tend to work quite a bit in the retail sector, and as I mentioned, my experience at Kiehl's really enabled me to work very, you know, thoroughly and intensely in the retail sector. So I suppose, as much as we live in this digital world, and again, as I sort of said, I try not to limit myself in terms of the mediums that I work in, but, you know, ultimately, I think most people would perceive that I've impacted, you know, retail DNA in a way that hopefully is memorable. You know, Kiehl's has now, I don't know how many points of sales all over the world. And, you know, part of that was my imprint. Obviously, it takes a village, but I was certainly, you know, a key member in driving that brand to what it became. So that's a nice lasting legacy. But I hope that everything that I do, and as I mentioned, we're building another store this year for this brand, which will be in New York City, will be also, you know, a legacy entity for the brand. And anything I touch from here on now, I suspect every brand that I touch, I hope is leaves a lasting imprint in a positive, memorable way. And I think if I've been part of those brands that now have a lasting imprint and impression and memorability, then hopefully I've done something great, not just for the people that work, you know, that appreciate those brands, but also for, let's not forget, shareholder value and why people buy and build brands. So hopefully I've impacted people's lives in a whole host of ways, whether it be financial or, you know, from a soul memorable and leaving a great first impression of any brand that I touch.
And if brands aren't profitable, they're probably not going to stay brands for long.
They're not, exactly. And we live in a really competitive, fierce world. I was lucky enough to meet the founder of Philosophy just a few days ago. And, you know, that's another great book for your book list, actually, The Rainbow Connection by Christina Carlino. Her book, she wrote it while she was creating Philosophy, and she herself is a very inspirational person, not just a scientist, but a singer and a songwriter and a poet, as you can see by the expression of the brand. That all started with Christina. You know, to have met her and listened to her speak about her journey was also, you know, interesting as it pertains to, you know, the work that I'm doing now and the future work that we'll do, and how that again leaves a lasting imprint on, you know, these brands that become something more. But yes, we all joined to make this entity much more, you know, bigger and profitable, and so it's going to be a healthy company that's going to be around for a long time.
Is there someone you know who is outside the spotlight but doing something important that's having an impact that the world should know about?
One of the nice parts of working on this brand is the charitable entity, which is we created a foundation which is called the Hope and Grace Initiative, which donates 1% of our sales to mental health issues. In working, within the sort of charitable sector, I've met all kinds of interesting people, but one of which that I met recently, Project 1 in 4. If you Google, you can find Project 1 in 4. And that is, an artist there who now I just found out she's left her full-time job and is focusing on Project 1 in 4 continually. And I don't know if you've seen it, if you've seen it on your, if you found it yet on Google, but she has all these lovely, enchanting sketches and is doing so much just to support this entity, which, a lot of people in this world of, how do I put this without becoming political? There's a lot of strife out in the world at the moment.
Is there?
I think people who are, making their own contribution to support and give back is an entity that can't be more encouraged. So she is somebody that's in my spotlight at the moment, and I think it's really cool what she's doing.
That's great. And that information will be in the show notes as well for folks who just want to find a direct link to that project. What is one thought that you'd like to leave with our community that you believe could make a difference in their lives?
Don't give up. See the future. Even when a project is really hard or when somebody's driving you absolutely up the wall, don't give up. Be relentless to creating something that is lasting and memorable and phenomenal and the best it can be. And I think you have to sieve out a lot of noise sometimes when you work in our sphere. And I try to encourage my team to do that. And I never forget, actually, one little sketch that a designer gave to me many years ago. And it was a picture of a sieve. And he drew all kinds of unsundry things that were sort of going into the sieve. And said, wow, Victoria, you have to sort of get all this sort of magic dust out at the end of this. And, sometimes I think you do have to kind of put yourself in a little bit of a bubble while still listening to your client or your customer, but just keeping it real, keeping it pure, and not being bogged down by people trying to take you off your course or try and change the story, or people who also want to be a creative director but might be a junior marketer that's just come out of school a year ago and may not have, the depth of a brand that you might. So I think you just have to really I would just encourage people to persevere and stay the course. It's an extraordinary amount of hours of work to become so adept in any craft, and just 1 hour at a time, day by day, make it great, make every day fun. I try and remind my team of that. In fact, we had a meeting yesterday and I said, that's it, let's just have fun. And I think you can lose sight of that really easily. So I would say, yeah, make it fun.
Make it fun. Also, as you were talking, I thought about it's a process. Have a big vision and take small steps.
Yeah, it is. It is. And just, sometimes you might need to put your sunglasses on and that's okay. And just, keep the big picture at the forefront and don't let people take you off your course.
If folks want to connect with you, what places are best?
I have a website and there's an info button there. I think it's info@victoriamaddocks.com, and it will find me, and anybody is free to reach out to me. And if I can give back in any bigger way than I currently do, drop me a line.
Wonderful. Any social media platforms that folks would want to engage with you?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Instagram. I am BMA_NYC. So you can also follow me there. You'll see pictures of my team there and having some of the fun. So as well as I need to really put more projects on there, actually, but I tend to put those on my website. I tend to keep my Instagram for other things that are potentially interesting me at any given time. So between that and my website, I try and keep a healthy plethora of visual stimuli.
Victoria, thank you. I appreciate your time, your thought, and the enthusiasm and intentionality that you bring to everything that I've seen you do.
Thank you so much, Charles. This has been interesting, and it's really great to meet you.
Thanks for listening to The Creator's Journey. If you enjoyed our theme music, the name of the song is You've Got a Home by Krista Wells. The Creator's Journey is published the first and third Sundays of each month, except for July and December. If you enjoyed the show, I would appreciate having you go to iTunes and subscribe. While you're there, if you give us a favorable rating and review, it'll make a huge difference in helping a newcomer easily find it. You can find links to today's guests, the people and books we talked about, and email me with your wonderful thoughts, all at thecreatorsjourney.com. I want to thank Yodelist for sponsoring this episode of The Creator's Journey. Yodelist is an interactive marketing platform for people in the creative world. With a vetted database of contacts from across the industry, Yodelist helps photographers, illustrators, creative directors, designers, producers, stylists, and many others to locate potential clients and gives them the tools to make those connections happen. If you want to find out how Yodelist helps creative people find one another for work, just go to yodelist.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/TCJ. There are over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.